There was an accusation today that puzzled a lot of people in Canadian political circles. A Tory MP from Calgary, Rob Anders, said he thinks NDP leader Thomas Mulcair helped hasten Jack Layton's death by pushing too hard behind the scenes in the last federal campaign, and that Mulcair was driven by his own fierce political aspirations. Anders later apologized, but it's just the latest in a series of gaffes by Anders, as Mike Lecouture reports it put the Tories on the defensive today.
What should the party do with Rob Anders and his comments?
As Conservative MPs filed into the House for question period, Rob Anders was nowhere to be seen, forcing his colleagues to answer for his actions.
Are you disappointed in this?
Yes.
I'd be surprised if people didn't react when Rob Anders speaks.
What people are reacting to is an interview Anders did with iPolitics. In it, the Calgary West MP suggested that Thomas Mulcair hastened Jack Layton's death. Anders said Mulcair pushed the former NDP leader into fighting the last election, despite his failing health.
That's just absolutely cold-hearted. What a kid, you know, and I say it's stronger than that, but what a complete kid. And he should be removed from Parliament altogether.
In a statement, Anders apologized, saying, "My comments with respect to Mr. Mulcair and Mr. Layton were insensitive and inconsiderate. I apologize to Mr. Mulcair and to Mr. Layton's family." Layton's widow, Olivia Chow, accepted the apology and said Anders' theory is nonsense.
Tom Mulcair loved Jack. We rather put all our energy in fighting for a better world, a better Canada, and not stab each other in the back.
Now, this isn't the first time Anders has attracted unwanted attention for his party. He fell asleep in the House of Commons and during a veterans meeting in Halifax. He even lashed out at the former soldiers who were giving the presentation, calling them NDP hacks and supporters of Russian strongman Vladimir Putin.
So Peter Van Loan, the government House leader, walked across the floor. He appears to be shaking his finger, and he's obviously visibly upset. Now, there are some words exchanged, and at some point, opposition leader Thomas Mulcair gets involved. There are allegations on both sides of foul language being used, perhaps inappropriate gestures. It really depends who you ask as to what went down, but Paul Dewar of the NDP walks over at one point to intervene, and then eventually we see the Defence Minister, Peter MacKay. He walks over to try and break things up. So you see him there leading the government House leader back across the floor. This is really an example of just how acrimonious the relationship between the government and the opposition has become of late.
It's also important to note that on February 8th, 2012, Mr. Patry voted in favor of an NDP motion that would declare vacant any seat of a person who had been elected who changed parties. We actually added in there that if you chose to sit as an independent, you wouldn't have to go through a by-election. You could sit as an independent. So there was actually a nuanced position that everyone voted for, including Mr. Patry. So that was his conviction then, and so we call upon him to have the courage of those convictions, to step down from his seat in Jonquière-Alma and run in a by-election if he thinks that the people of his riding support him. He's talked about all the people he's consulted. He just keeps forgetting one thing. He hasn't consulted his electors on this. So the Sherbrooke Declaration is the position of our party. We're a proud federalist party that works for a better life for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And Mr. Patry has said he's against floor crossing. That's the position that we want him to maintain.
You can go down some of the lists that are in there and realize that checking them off one by one, that Mr. Harper seems to be trying to put together some sort of adulterated version of NDP policies from the past. But if he's serious about wanting to do some of these things, let's take one specific example that he can actually act on. Robert Chisholm has a bill before Parliament right now to put an end to cyberbullying. He's worked hard with Rehtaeh Parsons' family. That bill is before the House. Now, Stephen Harper's serious. He'll come back to the House tomorrow and accept to adopt it 1, 2, 3, if this is more than simply political gamesmanship. We want to have that bill passed. Let's see if Stephen Harper can be believed on these issues. If Stephen Harper doesn't show up in the House tomorrow, that would be unprecedented. But he can continue to run, but I guarantee you he can't hide.
I saw something I'd not seen in a long, long time. Took a plane in mid-afternoon, and there was a television set in the waiting area to board the flight. And I thought, why are people all crowded in one section? There are plenty of seats, and people were actually standing around and sitting around watching question period.
You don't see that often.
I don't think I'd ever seen that.
Yeah. Well, and it was a question period or two that were actually worth watching, I think is
the sum total of that. I mean, we can get into all of the haranguing and the name calling, et cetera, but there was also some very probing questions and on occasion some answers from the Prime Minister.
Yeah, in every city that I was in several of them this week, I had the same experience that Chantal is describing. Lots of people really interested in politics to an extent that they haven't been before. We've talked about a lot of issues over the last year or two. We were kind of wondering why the public wasn't tuning in. Well, they are tuning in now.
All right, I want to play a bit of the back and forth today between the NDP leader, Tom Mulcair, and the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, because it highlights a couple of things. As we saw earlier in the newscast, Terry Milofsky talking about the change in what the Prime Minister says now about the number of people who knew about the deal, the Duffy-Wright deal. But watch this.
After firing Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister told Canadians in this House that absolutely no one else, not a few, no one else knew about the deal between Duffy and Wright. Now he admits that top Conservatives actually did know about the scheme, but they kept him in the dark knowingly, and they allowed him to make false statements to Parliament. But if that's true, why didn't he fire any of them?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Wright made this decision. He has been very clear. He informed very few people.
What's been proven to be false and turned out to be false is that no one else knew about it when 13 people knew about it, and he hasn't fired anybody.
Mr. Speaker, he alleges that many people knew about this. That is simply not correct. This was Mr. Wright's decision, using his own resources, and by his own admission, documented. He told very few people. The solution is not to have senators or anybody else pretend they're nonpartisan. It is to have them elected so they're accountable to the Canadian people.
How's that going, the elected Senate? They've had a bill about Senate reform on the books for 2 years. Do you know how many times they've called it? 0.
Tom Mulcair, in a way we haven't seen him, I don't think, since he's become leader of the NDP.
And this is obviously great ground for Tom Mulcair in his sort of lawyerly fashion, going after some of those gaps and contradictions.
You feel even when he looks like he's giving more answers, that he's skating on such a tiny rink that at some point he's always against, you know, the boards. And Mulcair can see that too. And today you saw an example of that this was the Prime Minister forever hitting one of his boards, and Mulcair very much enjoying it. I would say today that the person in control was the leader of the opposition and not the Prime Minister, and that's very rare in the history of Stephen Harper.
This was probably the first time that I can recall seeing the Prime Minister, who's quite an effective question period performer for the most part, be bested by Tom Mulcair. Tom Mulcair was not just as good as he's been. He was better than he's ever been, and better than we've seen in a long time in the House. So as the days unfold going forward, we're going to be seeing a very interesting and high level, high quality of debate in the House of Commons, I think.
Mulcair was clearly scoring points at the Prime Minister's expense, and at one point the Prime Minister had this in response. Watch this.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is now just starting to throw mud without any facts whatsoever. I look at the NDP and I remember the old saying, the more you throw mud, the more you lose ground.
This was from the party that destroyed Stéphane Dion with mud in ads, Michael Ignatieff with mud in ads, and went after Bob Rae with mud in ads. What's the difference?
Someone was also saying that this was a saying that Jean Chrétien had once used in similar circumstances.
Mm-hmm. You're nodding there, Andrew?
It was, indeed. I remember him saying it. It's a little too practiced aligned. I've never found it a particularly useful piece of rhetoric. It's a little too clever for its own good. But certainly we should all be careful of being too loose with accusations. But we can also be I don't know, too defensive about these things, which it seems to be he was.